Emerging Trends in Food Fraud 2024. 2 weeks ago, I talked about emerging trends in food safety. Now it's time for food fraud trends. Like my post about food safety trends, in this week's post, I discuss trends I've personally noticed in my weekly scans of hundreds of food industry news items and include hard data and concrete examples where available. The biggest trend in food fraud for 2024 is a positive one, hooray! With more enforcement agencies taking action against food fraud perpetrators and growing awareness of the intersections between food fraud, food safety and organised crime groups. Some countries are lagging behind. Australia and USA, I'm looking at you, but others are doing well. Standouts are the United Kingdom with the Food Crime Unit, that's the National Food Crime Unit and the Scottish Food Crime and Incidents Unit, as well as Italy, Spain and the European Union as a whole. With more enforcement, there have been more incidents reported in the past year. For example, the European Commission's annual report for the Alert and Cooperation Network, which covers food safety and food fraud suspicions and was published last week, describes a 26% increase in food fraud-related notifications over the previous year. Enforcement actions in Italy and Spain, especially related to olive oil and seafood traceability, have been frequent inclusions in the European Commission Joint Research Council's monthly food fraud reports as well. I've also noticed that fewer agencies are wasting energy trying to define food fraud exactly, or even wanting to understand whether a seller was intentionally misleading the market. As a reminder, many definitions of food fraud depend on the perpetrator's motivations. It only counts as true fraud if the perpetrator intended to mislead. Instead, enforcement activities are focused on falsified documents and food safety violations. For example, in 2023, there were a number of violations in live animal trading in France, mostly related to forged horse passports and health certificates. Such trading is illegal and could result in food safety violations, but the intention to commit food fraud does not need to be proven by authorities in order to pursue and punish such violations. Similarly, the EU Agri-Food Fraud Suspicions monthly reports include hundreds of alerts that may or may not be the result of deliberate fraud. The reports label them suspicions. For example, European pesticide residue violations, in which fruit or veg imported to Europe contains pesticides that are illegal in Europe, could be due to the ignorance of the farmer or importer about EU rules, an accidental violation, or could be done knowingly by importers who hope they won't be caught, fraud. But the EU suspicions reports don't distinguish between those scenarios. Food companies and laboratories are increasingly willing to share information. The Food Industry Intelligence Network has continued to grow, and members tell me they are reaping tangible rewards from the intelligence shared by the network. Great news! The high cost of developing and maintaining authenticity databases for analytical testing is not only being recognised as a significant barrier to testing for most food companies, but efforts to overcome these barriers have begun to bear fruit, with more public databases being developed and published. The Food Authenticity Network maintains a searchable list of analytical databases for authenticity testing held by laboratories and researchers, including their status as proprietary or public. In other food fraud emerging news for 2024, in the US, the fallout from the probably fraudulent adulteration of cinnamon in applesauce pouches continues. Commentators are calling for a review of the US recall process in the wake of the scandal. Suspicions about cinnamon have led to increased testing for heavy metals, leading to a number of recalls for ground cinnamon for high lead levels, although whether the lead is present due to accidental contamination or economically motivated adulteration isn't clear, since the concentrations aren't usually published. High concentrations are an indication of food fraud, while lower concentrations could be due to accidental contamination during growing or processing. There have been at least 7 recalls for lead in ground cinnamon since the 1st of July in the US. And if you haven't updated your vulnerability assessment for cinnamon to include lead chromate as a potential adulterant, do that now. Olive oil frauds are likely to continue because prices are still at record highs and the outlook is not expected to improve because growing conditions remain difficult due to climate change. While prices remain high, there remains a strong incentive to replace some or all of a package of olive oil with lower quality olive oil or cheaper vegetable oil. Cannabinoids, CBD, and THC containing CBD foods, which were rare 10 years ago, are an area of concern in Europe, where they're considered novel foods or novel ingredients and not allowed. Psychoactive foods, such as shroom candies, have caused food safety problems in the US and are considered a food fraud concern where their labelling or ingredient lists are misleading. Psychoactive foods marketed with branding that mimics popular children's food brands are similarly considered to be problematic. More data is emerging about the prevalence of undeclared pharmaceutical drugs in supplements, with rates at alarming levels. For example, a study published last year describes hundreds of incidents of unauthorised, undeclared pharmaceutical adulterants in food supplements and the presence of unauthorised supplements in the European Union. And this is almost certainly happening in other regions, it's just we don't have the data yet. Pharmaceuticals are added to make natural supplements more effective, but are not included on the label and usually aren't even legal as supplement ingredients. For example, red yeast supplements, which are said to be good for controlling cholesterol, were found to be adulterated with the undeclared drug lovastatin at a rate of 9% in a survey published in June. Common pharmaceutical adulterants include sexual health drugs such as sildenafil, that's Viagra, stimulants including 1,3-dimethylamine, which is an athletic performance enhancer and weight loss drug, and anabolics and prohormones, which are bodybuilding steroids. Other trends. There's a growing awareness of frauds in agricultural inputs such as pesticides, fertilizers, seeds, and animal feed. Plant protection products were a category with increased notifications in the 2023 EU Food Fraud ACN report, with illegal use and illegal trading the main fraud types. You can read about 2 recent pesticide frauds in this week's food fraud news as well. Seafood short waiting through the use of undeclared glazing, undeclared water addition, or the use of undeclared or unauthorised additives or preservatives is a growing concern in Europe. Protected designations, that's PDO and PGI designations, are the basis for an increasing number of fraud claims. For example, Greece and Cyprus have been claiming that businesses in other countries are using the terms feta cheese and halloumi cheese illegally. Cross-border issues with illegal additives and pesticides seem to be becoming more prevalent. For example, some candies imported from the USA are illegal in Britain due to the presence of unauthorised food additives. If the importer or retailer sells the candies knowing they're illegal, that's food fraud. Pesticide rules similarly vary from place to place and are the basis for dozens of European import alerts each month. Possible emerging risk is low-grade tuna, which is said to be increasingly treated with a concoction of additives, which are not always illegal but are often not declared. In the Food Fraud News from issue 145 in June, I reported that around 60% of tuna exported from Vietnam is allegedly being treated with chemicals to give it a vibrant red colour, a practice which began around 5 years ago. The treatments are legal in the USA if labelled, but illegal in Europe. The soon-to-be enforced EU deforestation rules, or the EUDR rules, which affect coffee, cocoa, soy, beef and palm oil, have already caused disruptions in supply chains. The rules create motivations for fraud in the documentation that accompanies shipments to the EU. In addition, possible price differentials between EUDR compliant shipments and non-compliant shipments create opportunities for bad actors to profit from fraudulent trading. Takeaways for food professionals. In the food fraud landscape, much remains unchanged. Where a profit can be made, fraudsters will continue to exploit weaknesses in the food systems. However, more enforcement activities, at least in some parts of the world, seem to be making a difference, especially where they involve the dismantling of large criminal networks. There's an increasing appetite for information sharing among food businesses and analytical service providers, which will strengthen the fight against food fraud. Food businesses of all sizes can benefit from initiatives including the Food Industry Intelligence Network and the Food Authenticity Network. While the most fraud-affected commodities continue to be at the top of food fraud lists, there is more activity or awareness about fraud in cinnamon, olive oil, supplements, seafood and pesticides, and probable emerging risks for commodities affected by the EUDR. In short, food fraud trends for 2024 include more enforcement and a growing willingness to share information, particularly in the UK and EU. Seafood, olive oil and cinnamon have all been affected by fraud in the past 12 months. I've noticed an increase in cross-border issues from pesticides and additives that are legal in some countries but not others. The illegal selling of psychoactive foods may be becoming more prevalent. More data about undeclared pharmaceuticals and supplements is available, and it's alarming. And disruptions to the supply chains of EUDR affected commodities are creating new fraud opportunities. As always, you will find all the sources for everything that I've said in the email and the post. And just a reminder, I spend so many hours every week scanning thousands of articles to find the most interesting ones for you. So do consider upgrading to a paid subscription if you haven't done so yet.